Every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, she unlocked the same glass door, flipped the same worn sign from closed to open, and prepared for another day of helping contractors find the right screws and suburban homeowners pick out paint colors. To everyone in the small Texas town of Cedar Ridge, she was just Margaret Maggie Chen, the quiet, efficient woman who'd run Henderson's hardware for the past 8 years. She knew every bolt size, every tool brand, and could fix almost anything that walked through her door. But what nobody knew was that the woman organizing nuts and bolts had once been one of the most classified operatives in U.S. military history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The transformation had been so complete that even Maggie sometimes forgot who she used to be. Gone were the days of rappelling from helicopters in the dead of night, infiltrating enemy compounds, and speaking 7 languages fluently while posing as everything from a journalist to a diplomat's wife. Now her biggest challenge was explaining to Mrs. Patterson why her sprinkler system kept failing, or helping teenage Jake Morrison figure out which wrench would work on his motorcycle. Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest news was usually who won the high school football game or whose prize roses were blooming best. The hardware store sat right on Main Street, sandwiched between Betty's Diner and the old barber shop that had been there since 1952. It was exactly the kind of unremarkable place where someone could disappear into plain sight, which was precisely why Maggie had chosen it. But on this particular Tuesday morning in September, as Maggie arranged a new shipment of garden hoses in the front window display, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Across the street, pretending to read a newspaper outside the diner, sat a man in a baseball cap and jeans. To anyone else, he would have looked perfectly normal, just another local taking his time with his morning coffee and catching up on the news. But Maggie's trained eyes caught the details others would miss. The way he held his shoulders, the systematic method of his apparent casual glances around the street, the slight bulge under his left arm that suggested a concealed weapon. Most telling of all was the newspaper itself. It was yesterday's edition, and he'd been holding it upside down for the past 10 minutes. Her hands continued arranging the hoses with practiced calm, but her mind was racing. After 8 years of peaceful anonymity, had someone finally found her? And if so, who? The possibilities were numerous, and none of them good. There were the obvious candidates, foreign intelligence services who might still hold grudges from her operational days. There were criminal organizations she'd helped dismantle during her time with various classified task forces. There were even some elements within her own government who might have reasons to track down former operatives like herself. The morning proceeded with excruciating normalcy. Old Mr. Hendricks came in looking for replacement parts for his ancient lawnmower, chattering away about his grandson's upcoming wedding as if the world hadn't potentially shifted on its axis. Sarah Wilmot dropped by for paint samples, debating between Sage Whisper and Morning Meadow for her kitchen, while Maggie's peripheral vision never left the man across the street. Even young Tommy Rodriguez showed up with his usual Tuesday morning energy, helping unload a delivery truck and peppering Maggie with questions about her weekend plans. To all of them, she was the same reliable Maggie she'd always been, offering helpful advice, remembering their preferences, occasionally sharing a gentle joke or asking about their families. But internally, she was conducting a thorough tactical assessment. Every entry and exit point of the store was cataloged in her mind. The locations of potential weapons, everything from hammer handles to cutting tools, were mentally mapped. Even the most innocent customer interaction was analyzed for signs of surveillance or threat. The man with the newspaper finally left around noon, but Maggie knew better to relax. If this was the beginning of what she feared it might be, then one watcher meant there were others. Professional surveillance teams work in rotations, and someone with the resources to find Margaret Chen after 8 years of careful hiding would certainly have the resources to maintain proper coverage of their target. As the afternoon wore on, she began to spot them. There was the woman in the blue Honda who'd driven past the store 4 times in 2 hours, each time slowing down just slightly as she passed. There was the jogger who'd stretched on the corner for an unusually long time, while apparently cooling down from his run. Most concerning was the utility worker who claimed to be checking power lines, but whose van had Idaho plates, over 1,000 miles from home for routine maintenance work. By closing time, Maggie had confirmed what she had feared from the morning. She was under active surveillance by what appeared to be a professional team. The question now wasn't whether her cover was blown, it was what they wanted and how much time she had before they made their move. As she locked up the store and walked to her modest apartment above Miller's Bakery, she moved with the same unhurried pace she'd maintained for 8 years. But her mind was already shifting into a mode she had hoped never to access again. That night, while Cedar Ridge slept peacefully around her, Margaret Chen began preparing for the possibility that her quiet life as a hardware store clerk was about to come to an explosive end. The apartment above the bakery had always been perfect for Maggie's needs. Small, unassuming, and most importantly, it came with multiple escape routes she had identified and planned for within her first week of living there. There was the obvious front staircase that led down to the bakery's customer area, but there was also a rear fire escape that connected to the alley behind Main Street, a maintenance ladder that provided roof access, and in the most extreme circumstances, a carefully weakened section of flooring that would allow her to drop directly into the bakery's storage room below. Tonight, for the first time in 8 years, she accessed the emergency cache she'd hidden behind a false wall in her bedroom closet. The contents looked innocuous enough to most people: some old photo albums, a few pieces of jewelry, some documents in a manila envelope. But Maggie's fingers moved with practiced efficiency as she revealed the cache's true contents. 3 different sets of identification documents, each representing a complete identity with matching credit cards and background histories. $47,000 in various currencies. An encrypted satellite phone that could reach contacts across the globe. And finally, carefully wrapped in moisture-proof material, a ceramic knife, and a compact pistol that had been specially modified to be nearly undetectable by most standard security screening methods. She had hoped never to see these items again. Their very existence felt like a betrayal of the peaceful life she'd built in Cedar Ridge. A life where her biggest concerns were maintaining inventory levels and helping neighbors with their weekend projects. But as she tested the satellite phone's connection and verified that her emergency contacts were still active, she couldn't deny the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with preparation for an unknown mission. The phone call she made at 2:17 a.m. was brief and coded, lasting exactly 93 seconds. To anyone monitoring communications traffic, it would have sounded like a woman calling her sister about a family emergency. But the person on the other end, a man she knew only as Phoenix and hadn't spoken to in over a decade, understood immediately that Margaret Chen was requesting an emergency extraction and threat assessment. "The hardware business been treating you well?" Phoenix asked, his voice carrying the slight rasp she remembered from their operational days together. "No complaints until today," she replied, using their old code to indicate that her cover had been compromised. "Had some unusual customers browsing around, the kind who look but don't buy. Professional shoppers? Multiple teams, rotational surveillance, at least 6 individuals confirmed. Quality equipment and training." There was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted long enough to make Maggie wonder if the connection had been lost. When Phoenix finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard since their darkest operational days together. "Maggie, you need to understand something. This isn't random. 3 other assets from your operational period have gone dark in the past 6 months. All of them were living under deep cover, all of them had been clean for years, and all of them disappeared without a trace." The news hit her like a physical blow. During her active years, she'd worked with dozens of operatives across various classified programs, but there were perhaps 20 individuals who shared her clearance and operational knowledge. If 3 of them had already been compromised, it suggested something far more serious than routine intelligence gathering by foreign services. "Any pattern to the disappearances?" she asked, her mind automatically shifting into analytical mode. All 3 were involved in Operation Silent Thunder. All three had been successfully extracted and relocated with new identities, and all three started showing signs of surveillance approximately 2 weeks before they vanished. Operation Silent Thunder. Even hearing the codename after all these years sent a chill through Maggie's body. It had been the culmination of her entire career in special operations, a multi-year infiltration of an international criminal network that had been selling weapons to terrorist organizations. The operation had been so sensitive that fewer than a dozen people knew its full scope, and the intelligence gathered had prevented at least 3 major terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. But Silent Thunder had also been the operation that ended her career. What should have been a routine extraction had gone catastrophically wrong when someone leaked their position to the enemy. Half her team had died in the resulting firefight, and Maggie herself had barely escaped with critical intelligence that ultimately brought down the entire network. The official investigation had never determined who had betrayed them, but Maggie had always suspected that the leak had come from somewhere high up in the intelligence community itself. Maggie, if someone's systematically hunting Silent Thunder operatives, then we're not dealing with foreign intelligence or criminal revenge. This is domestic, and it's someone with access to classified relocation records. That's what we're afraid of, Phoenix confirmed, which is why extraction isn't an option right now. Every safe house, every contact, every evacuation route could be compromised. You're safer maintaining your cover and staying mobile than you would be trusting any official channels. The reality of her situation was becoming clear. She was essentially on her own in the middle of a small Texas town, surrounded by surveillance teams with enemies who had apparently already succeeded in eliminating 3 of her former colleagues. Her cover identity as Margaret Chen had provided 8 years of safety, but that safety was now an illusion that could shatter at any moment. "What do you need from me?" Phoenix asked. "Time," she replied, "and information. I need to know everything you can find out about how they located me, what resources they have available, and most importantly, what they want. Are they killing assets or taking them?" Unknown. The 3 who disappeared left no trace, no bodies, no evidence of struggle, nothing. They simply vanished. As dawn began to creep through her apartment windows, Maggie realized that her carefully constructed peaceful life was about to become a battlefield.
The next morning brought an uncomfortable revelation. Maintaining the appearance of normalcy while under professional surveillance required skills that Maggie had hoped were permanently retired. As she went through her usual routine of opening Henderson's hardware, she had to consciously suppress years of tactical training that screamed at her to vary her patterns, check for ambush points, and maintain constant situational awareness. Instead, she forced herself to move with the same predictable rhythm that Margaret Chen had followed for 8 years. Unlock the door at exactly 6 a.m., turn on the lights in the same sequence, start the coffee maker, and begin her daily inventory check. But even as she performed these mundane actions, her trained mind was cataloging everything. The surveillance team had rotated overnight, with fresh faces replacing yesterday's watchers. These new operatives were good, better than the previous team actually, which suggested that whoever was running this operation had considerable resources and was taking her capabilities seriously. The woman pretending to wait for a bus across the street was carrying herself like someone with military training. The man reading a magazine in his car had positioned himself with clear sightlines to all of the hardware store's entrances and exits. Most telling was the fact that they weren't trying to be completely invisible. Professional surveillance teams could have maintained coverage without being detected by most targets, but Maggie was clearly not most targets. They wanted her to know she was being watched, which meant this wasn't simple intelligence gathering. This was psychological pressure, designed to force her into making a mistake or revealing information they needed. The morning's first customer was Mrs. Patterson, arriving right on schedule to complain about her sprinkler system again. As Maggie helped her select replacement parts, she noticed something that made her pause. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in Cedar Ridge for 37 years and knew every detail of local gossip, was asking unusually specific questions about Maggie's background, where she'd lived before coming to Texas, whether she had family nearby, if she'd ever traveled internationally. At first, Maggie assumed the elderly woman was simply being more curious than usual, but when Mrs. Patterson mentioned that some nice federal agents had stopped by her house yesterday asking about the neighborhood's residents, alarm bells began ringing. If the surveillance team was conducting interviews with locals, it meant they were building a comprehensive intelligence picture and weren't planning to conclude their operation quickly. The federal agent story also provided a crucial piece of information. Whoever was hunting her had legitimate government credentials. That narrowed the field considerably and confirmed her worst suspicions about Operation Silent Thunder. This wasn't foreign intelligence or criminal retaliation. This was someone within the U.S. government cleaning up loose ends from an operation that officially never existed. Around mid-morning, a new player entered the game. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up directly in front of the hardware store, and two men in dark suits stepped out. Unlike the surveillance team, these individuals made no attempt at subtlety. They walked straight to the store's entrance with the confident stride of people who were accustomed to having doors opened for them. The first man was tall and lean, with the bearing of someone who'd spent considerable time in military command positions. His companion was shorter but broader, with hands that bore the calluses of someone who'd done serious physical training. Both wore earpieces and carried themselves with the controlled readiness that Maggie recognized from her own operational days. "Margaret Chen?" he asked as they entered the store, though his tone suggested this was a formality rather than a genuine question. "That's me," she replied, continuing to organize a display of screwdrivers with steady hands. "What can I help you gentlemen with today?" "Agent Morrison, FBI," he said, producing credentials that looked authentic, but which Maggie suspected would not check out if verified through normal channels. "This is Agent Thompson. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your time living in Cedar Ridge." "Of course," she replied, noting that both men had positioned themselves to control the store's main exit while maintaining clear lines of sight to her. "Though I have to say, it's been pretty quiet around here. Not much that would interest federal agents, I'd imagine." Agent Morrison smiled, but it was the kind of expression that never reached his eyes. "You'd be surprised what can interest us, Miss Chen. Or should I say, Ms. Wang, or perhaps you prefer Commander Harrison. You've used so many names over the years, it's hard to keep track." The use of her operational aliases confirmed that these men had access to highly classified information. Commander Harrison was her cover identity during the deepest phases of Operation Silent Thunder, known to fewer than 6 people in the entire intelligence community. If they knew that name, they weren't just hunting Silent Thunder operatives. They were people who had been directly involved in the operation itself. "I'm sorry," she said, maintaining her confused, small-town store clerk persona, "but I think you've got me confused with someone else. I've been Margaret Chen for as long as I can remember. Born in California, moved here from Arizona about 8 years ago. Never been in the military, never used any other names." Agent Thompson spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight Boston accent. "Miss Chen, we know you've built a nice life here. Good relationships with your neighbors, respected member of the community, even coaching Little League on weekends. It would be a shame if that life had to end because of unfinished business from your past." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. They weren't just here to arrest her or eliminate her. They wanted something, and they were willing to leverage the life she'd built to get it. "What exactly do you think I can help you with?" she asked. "Operation Silent Thunder," Agent Morrison replied. "Specifically, we need to know what happened to certain intelligence materials that went missing during the operation's conclusion." For the first time since the surveillance had begun, Maggie felt genuinely surprised. after 8 years, someone was still hunting for Silent Thunder's missing files.
The mention of missing intelligence materials from Operation Silent Thunder sent Maggie's mind racing back to that chaotic night 8 years ago when everything had gone wrong. She remembered the weight of the encrypted drives in her tactical vest as bullets shattered the windows around her, the screams of her team members as the supposed safe house turned into a death trap, and the desperate sprint through narrow alleyways as enemy forces closed in from all directions. But most of all, she remembered the split-second decision that had saved her life and apparently created a problem that was still hunting her nearly a decade later. "I am afraid I don't know what you're talking about," she said to the two agents, though her mind was already working through the implications of their presence. If they were asking about missing files, it meant that the official story about Silent Thunder's conclusion, that all intelligence materials had been recovered and secured, was a lie. Agent Morrison stepped closer to the counter, close enough that Maggie could smell his cologne and see the small scar on his left temple that suggested he'd seen combat himself. "Ms. Chen, let me be very direct with you. We know who you are, we know what you did during your operational years, and we know that you were the last person to have access to certain classified materials before they disappeared. We're not here to arrest you or to punish you for actions taken during a chaotic situation. We're here because those materials are now a national security threat, and we need your help recovering them." The interesting thing about Agent Morrison's statement was what he didn't say. He didn't claim that she had stolen the materials or that she was in trouble for possessing them. Instead, he was positioning this as a patriotic duty, an opportunity for her to help her country one more time. It was a sophisticated psychological approach, and it told her that these men had studied her personality profile and knew that appeals to duty and service had always been effective motivators for her. But it also told her something else. They weren't entirely certain she actually had the missing files. If they were sure, they would have come with a full tactical team and search warrants. The fact that they were here asking politely suggested that they were operating on intelligence that was less than definitive. "Even if I was this person you think I am, why would you think I'd have kept classified materials? Wouldn't that be incredibly dangerous and illegal?" Agent Thompson smiled and pulled out a tablet computer, swiping to display what appeared to be surveillance photos. 3 weeks ago, a terrorist cell in Eastern Europe tried to sell what they claimed were classified U.S. intelligence documents to Russian operatives. The sale was intercepted by friendly intelligence services, but the documents turned out to be sophisticated fakes, accurate enough to fool initial examination, but missing key details that would only be known to someone who'd had access to the original materials. He swiped to another image showing what looked like classified document headers. The interesting thing is that the fakes were too good to be random guesswork. Someone with intimate knowledge of the original documents created these counterfeits, either as a test run for selling the real materials or as a way to gauge market interest while keeping the authentic documents safely hidden. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand what was happening. Someone wasn't just hunting Silent Thunder operatives for revenge or to tie up loose ends. They were systematically eliminating anyone who might have access to intelligence materials that had apparently become extremely valuable on the black market. "So you think," she said slowly, "that someone is trying to sell classified materials from this Operation Silent Thunder?" "We don't think it, we know it. What we don't know is whether the seller is one of the missing operatives or whether they're being coerced into cooperating by whoever has been hunting Silent Thunder team members." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The implications were staggering. If 3 Silent Thunder operatives had been captured rather than killed, they could have been tortured for information about the operation's intelligence haul. If the materials were being sold on the black market, it meant that terrorists and hostile nations could potentially access some of the most sensitive intelligence the United States had gathered in decades. And if she was being approached as a potential source rather than a suspect, it meant that the agents believed she might have information that could help them stop the sales.
"What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said. Agent Thompson leaned against the counter in what was probably meant to be a casual gesture, but which positioned him within arm's reach of her. "We're asking you to come with us to a secure facility where you can be debriefed about Operation Silent Thunder. Help us understand what intelligence materials were compromised, who might have had access to them, and how we can track down whoever is trying to profit from selling American secrets to our enemies." It sounded reasonable, even patriotic, but Maggie had spent too many years in covert operations to miss the underlying reality. Once she walked out of this hardware store with these agents, she would disappear into the same black hole that had swallowed 3 of her former colleagues. Whether she actually possessed the missing intelligence materials or not, she clearly knew too much about Operation Silent Thunder to be allowed to remain free. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Agent Morrison's friendly expression didn't change, but his voice carried a harder edge. "Miss Chen, you've built a wonderful life here in Cedar Ridge. You've got friends who care about you, neighbors who depend on you, even some who consider you family. It would be tragic if your past caught up with you in a way that affected innocent people." The threat was clear. Cooperate or watch everyone she cared about in this small town pay the price for her refusal. As if summoned by the mention of innocent people, the hardware store's door chimed and Tommy Rodriguez walked in, still wearing his high school football practice uniform and grinning with the uncomplicated enthusiasm that had made Maggie one of her favorite people in Cedar Ridge. "Hey, Miss Chen," he called out. "My mom wanted me to ask if you had any of those special screws for her cabinet hinges, and also whether you wanted to come to my game Friday night. We're playing Central High, and Coach thinks we actually have a chance this time." The presence of the 17-year-old boy seemed to fill the store with normalcy, reminding everyone present that they were standing in the middle of a community where people cared about cabinet hinges and high school football games. But it also made the stakes of Maggie's situation crystal clear.
Tommy's arrival created an immediate tension that seemed to fill the hardware store like a toxic gas. Here was everything that Maggie's new life represented: innocence, community, the simple pleasure of caring about whether the local high school team could beat their rivals, standing directly in the path of a conflict that could destroy not just her carefully constructed identity, but the lives of everyone she'd grown to love in Cedar Ridge. "The cabinet hinges are on aisle 3, Tommy," she said with a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "Tell your mom I'll save her some of the brass-plated ones that just came in. And of course I'll be at your game Friday. Wouldn't miss it." The 2 agents watched this interaction with the studied interest of professionals evaluating a potential pressure point. She could see them cataloging Tommy's obvious affection for her, his trust, the way he lit up when she promised to attend his football game. They were calculating how much leverage they could gain by threatening his safety, or his family's safety, or the safety of everyone else in town who had welcomed Margaret Chen into their lives. "Cool. Oh, and Miss Chen, my dad wanted to know if you needed any help with that broken step in your apartment. He's got some free time this weekend and said it wouldn't be any trouble." "That's very kind of him, but I think I can handle it myself." Though part of her wanted to scream at the boy to run, to get as far away from the store as possible before he became collateral damage in a war he couldn't even comprehend. After Tommy had found his mother's hinges and left with a cheerful wave, Agent Morrison returned to their conversation as if there had been no interruption. "Nice kid. Star quarterback, good grades, planning to study engineering in college if he gets the right scholarships. It would be a shame if his future got complicated by association with someone with a problematic past." The threat was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it took Maggie's breath away. These men were prepared to destroy the life of an innocent 17-year-old boy simply to ensure her cooperation. It was a level of callousness that told her more about their true nature than any credentials or official documentation could have had. "You would threaten a child to get what you want?" she asked. "We're not threatening anyone," Agent Thompson replied smoothly. "We're simply pointing out that secrets have a way of coming to light. And when they do, they often affect more people than just the person keeping them. Wouldn't it be better to resolve the situation quietly and professionally before it becomes the kind of messy incident that draws media attention and federal investigations?" It was a masterful piece of manipulation, she had to admit. They weren't explicitly threatening violence against Tommy or anyone else in Cedar Ridge. Instead, they were suggesting that her refusal to cooperate would inevitably lead to exposure and scandal that would destroy the lives of innocent people. They were positioning themselves as the reasonable option, the path that would protect everyone she cared about. But Maggie had seen too much of the intelligence world to believe that cooperating would actually keep anyone safe. If these men were willing to hunt down and eliminate Silent Thunder operatives, they weren't going to leave loose ends. Cooperating would buy time, nothing more. And it would give them access to whatever information she possessed while they planned the most effective way to ensure her permanent silence. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "Of course, but not too much time. Every day that passes is another day that classified materials might fall into the wrong hands. We'll give you until tomorrow morning to make your decision." The two men left as abruptly as they'd arrived, walking back to their black SUV with the confident stride of people who believed they'd successfully applied the right amount of pressure to achieve their desired result. But as soon as they were gone, Maggie felt the full weight of her situation crashing down on her. She was trapped between impossible choices. Cooperating with the agents would almost certainly lead to her death, but it might keep the people of Cedar Ridge safe from retaliation. Refusing to cooperate would put everyone she cared about at risk, but would give her a chance to fight back and possibly expose whatever conspiracy was systematically eliminating Silent Thunder operatives. As closing time approached, Maggie made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of activating her escape plans or attempting to contact her old intelligence network for support, she did something that Margaret Chen would do. She called the people she trusted most in Cedar Ridge and asked them for their help. The first call was to Sheriff Reynolds, a 30-year veteran of law enforcement who had become a genuine friend over the years. The second was to Dr. Sarah Wilmot, whose husband had been a Marine colonel before his death in Afghanistan and understood better than most what it meant to carry dangerous secrets. The third call was to Frank Morrison, Tommy's father, and the town's most respected contractor who had never asked questions about her past, but had always been there when she needed help. By nightfall, Margaret Chen had done something that would have horrified her former intelligence handlers. She had created a security team composed entirely of civilians who knew nothing about covert operations, but everything about protecting their own community.
The meeting took place in the back room of Betty's diner after closing time, a space that smelled of coffee and pie and represented everything normal about Cedar Ridge. Sheriff Reynolds had arrived first, still wearing his uniform, but with the kind of weariness that came from dealing with too many problems and not enough solutions. Dr. Wilmot came next, carrying herself with the quiet strength that had helped her rebuild her life after losing her husband in combat. Frank Morrison completed the group, bringing the calm competence that had made him the town's go-to person when anything needed fixing. Maggie looked at these three people, her friends, her chosen family, and realized she was about to shatter their understanding of who she was. For 8 years, they had known her as someone uncomplicated, reliable, perhaps a little mysterious about her past, but ultimately just another resident of their small town. Now, she was going to ask them to accept that the woman who had helped organize school fundraisers and coached Little League was actually a former covert operative being hunted by people willing to kill to protect government secrets. "I need to tell you all something that's going to be hard to believe," she began, then paused as she tried to find words that wouldn't sound completely insane. "Those federal agents who were asking questions around town today, they weren't really federal agents, and they're here because of who I used to be before I came to Cedar Ridge." Sheriff Reynolds leaned forward, his law enforcement instincts immediately engaged. "What kind of trouble are you in, Maggie?" "The kind that could get all of you killed if you're not careful," she replied, then spent the next 20 minutes giving them an abbreviated version of her history. She told them about Operation Silent Thunder, about the missing intelligence materials, about the 3 operatives who had disappeared, and about the impossible choice she was facing between cooperation and resistance. The silence that followed her explanation stretched long enough to make her wonder if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. These were good people, but they were civilians,
Asking them to understand the world of covert operations and government conspiracies was like asking them to suddenly speak a foreign language. Dr. Wilmot was the first to speak. When James was deployed, he used to call me using code words when he couldn't talk openly about what was happening. He said that if I ever heard certain phrases, I should pack up Sarah and disappear until he could contact me safely. She paused, studying Maggie's face carefully. "You've got that same look he had when he was trying to protect me from something dangerous." Sheriff Reynolds was more direct. "Maggie, I've been in law enforcement for 30 years. I've seen federal agents, and I've seen people pretending to be federal agents. Those two today, they had the credentials, but they didn't have the attitude. Real feds are usually either bureaucratic or apologetic when they're disrupting small-town life. These guys acted like they owned the place." Frank Morrison, who had been silent through most of the explanation, finally spoke up. "My boy thinks the world of you, Maggie. Tommy's had a rough time since his mother and I divorced, but you've been there for him when he needed someone to listen. If there are people trying to hurt you, then they're trying to hurt my family too." The simple loyalty in his voice nearly brought tears to her eyes. These people were willing to accept her story, willing to help her, not because they understood the complexities of international espionage, but because she had become part of their community and they protected their own. "I don't want to put any of you at risk, but I also don't know how to handle this situation alone. If I cooperate with these people, they'll probably kill me once they get what they want. If I refuse, they've made it clear that people in this town will pay the price." Dr. Wilmot pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts. "I still have connections from James's military days, people who might be able to verify whether these agents are legitimate or not. And I've got law enforcement contacts who can run background checks without leaving official fingerprints. If these guys are imposters, there might be a paper trail that proves it." Frank Morrison was already thinking tactically. "What do you need from us right now? Security? Places to hide? Ways to get out of town without being seen?" The willingness of these three people to immediately shift into protective mode, despite having no experience with this kind of threat, was both humbling and terrifying. They were offering to put their lives on the line for her, and they had no idea what they were getting into. "First, we need to figure out exactly who we're dealing with," Maggie said, her mind shifting into operational mode. "If Dr. Wilmot can verify through her military contacts whether these agents are legitimate, and Sheriff Reynolds can check their credentials through law enforcement channels, we might be able to determine if they're rogue operatives or if this is an officially sanctioned operation." "What's the difference?" Frank asked. "If they're rogue operatives, we can expose them and get help from legitimate authorities. If they're official, then the entire U.S. government considers me a threat that needs to be eliminated, and we're on our own." Sheriff Reynolds was already taking notes on a small pad he'd pulled from his shirt pocket. "What about the surveillance teams? If we can identify them, maybe we can turn the tables and start watching the watchers." "That's more dangerous than you realize," Maggie warned. "These people are trained professionals. If they detect counter-surveillance, they might escalate to direct action instead of waiting for me to cooperate voluntarily." Dr. Wilmot looked up from her phone. "I've got someone who might be able to help. Colonel Martinez worked with James on several classified operations. He's retired now, but he still has connections throughout the intelligence community. If there's an active operation targeting former operatives, he would probably know about it. How much can you tell him without compromising operational security? I mean, how much can you tell him without putting him or us at risk?" James always said that Martinez was someone who could be trusted with anything. He's the kind of officer who puts his people before his career. As they began planning their next moves, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the comfort of working with a team she could trust completely. These three people might not have military training or intelligence experience, but they had something more valuable: absolute loyalty to their community and everyone in it. But even as hope began to grow in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all walking into something much more dangerous than any of them realized.
Tomorrow morning, the fake agents would expect an answer, and whatever happened next would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone she'd grown to love in Cedar Ridge. Outside the diner, the surveillance teams maintained their positions, unaware that the quiet hardware clerk they were watching had just recruited the most dangerous opponents they could possibly face, people fighting to protect their home.
The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline Texas dawn that usually filled Maggie with appreciation for the simple beauty of her adopted home. But today, as she went through her routine of opening Henderson's hardware, every familiar action felt like it might be the last time she performed it. The coffee maker gurgling to life, the satisfying click of the cash register's drawer, the way the morning sunlight streamed through the front windows, all of it took on the poignancy of a goodbye she wasn't ready to say. Dr. Wilmot's contact had worked through the night, and the news wasn't good. Colonel Martinez had confirmed that there was no official operation targeting Silent Thunder operatives. In fact, according to his sources, Operation Silent Thunder was so classified that most current intelligence officials didn't even know it had existed. This meant that whoever was hunting former operatives was doing so without government authorization, which made them far more dangerous than legitimate agents would have been. Rogue operatives don't follow rules of engagement, Martinez had told Dr. Wilmot during their early morning phone call. They don't have oversight, they don't have legal constraints, and they don't have to justify their actions to anyone. If someone is systematically eliminating Silent Thunder personnel, they're doing it for personal reasons, and that makes them extremely unpredictable. Sheriff Reynolds had spent the early hours of the morning conducting his own investigation, using law enforcement databases to research the fake agent's credentials. What he found confirmed Maggie's worst fears. Agent Morrison and Agent Thompson were using the identities of two real FBI agents who had been killed in a car accident 3 months earlier. Someone with significant resources and intelligence connections had stolen the identities of dead federal agents and was using them to hunt down classified operatives. Frank Morrison had contributed in his own way, using his construction crew's network throughout the county to identify and track the surveillance teams. His workers had innocently documented license plates, taken photographs of suspicious characters, and mapped the locations of vehicles that had been parked in unusual places for extended periods of time. The picture that emerged was sobering. There were at least 8 operatives maintaining coverage of Cedar Ridge with equipment and coordination that suggested military-level training and funding. By 9 a.m. when the fake agents returned to the hardware store, Maggie had armed herself with information that changed the entire dynamic of their confrontation. She knew who they really were, she understood the scope of their operation, and most importantly, she had backup that they knew nothing about. Ms. Chen, Agent Morrison said as he and his partner entered the store with the same confident bearing they'd displayed the day before. "We trust you've had time to consider our conversation yesterday." "I have," she replied, continuing to arrange a display of garden tools while keeping her hands positioned near a hammer that could serve as a weapon if necessary. "But I have some questions before I give you my answer." Agent Thompson moved to block the store's main exit, a tactical positioning that would have been subtle to most people, but which Maggie read as clearly as a written threat. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that real FBI agents wouldn't mind answering. For instance, I'm curious about how Agent Morrison and Agent Thompson managed to return from the dead, considering that both of those identities belong to federal agents who died in Virginia 3 months ago." The change in their demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Agent Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon, while Agent Thompson's stance shifted from casual to combat ready. For a moment, the hardware store was filled with the kind of tension that preceded violence, the air practically crackling with the potential for sudden, explosive action. "That's an interesting theory," Agent Morrison said carefully, though his voice had lost all pretense of friendly professionalism. "Where might you have gotten information like that?" "From people who know how to verify federal credentials, the same people who've been documenting your surveillance teams and tracking your operations since you arrived in Cedar Ridge."
It was a calculated risk, revealing that she had support from locals, but it was also a necessary move to shift the balance of power in the conversation. These men had been operating under the assumption that she was isolated and vulnerable, with no resources beyond her own skills and training. Learning that she had recruited help from the community would force them to reassess their approach. Agent Thompson spoke for the first time since entering the store, his Boston accent more pronounced now that he wasn't trying to maintain a professional facade. "You've made some very dangerous choices, Ms. Chen. Involving civilians in a classified operation puts them at significant risk." "No," she replied firmly. "You put them at risk when you came here with your fake credentials and your threats against innocent people. I'm just trying to protect my community from people who are willing to murder federal agents and steal their identities." The accusation hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Neither of the fake agents denied it, which told her everything she needed to know about their willingness to kill to achieve their objectives. "What do you want?" Agent Morrison asked, finally, his pretense of government authority completely abandoned. "Information," she replied. "I want to know who you're working for, what happened to the 3 missing Silent Thunder operatives, and what you really want with the classified materials from that operation." "And if we refuse to answer your questions?" Maggie smiled, and for the first time since this confrontation had begun, she felt like she was back in control of the situation. Sheriff Reynolds is parked outside with backup units from 3 counties. Dr. Wilmot has military intelligence contacts who are very interested in talking to people who've been impersonating federal agents. And Frank Morrison has about 20 construction workers positioned around town who are all armed and very unhappy about strangers threatening their neighbors. It wasn't entirely true. The backup units were actually just Sheriff Reynolds and his 2 deputies, and Frank's construction workers were equipped with tools rather than weapons. But the psychological impact was exactly what she had hoped for. Both fake agents looked genuinely surprised to discover that their target had managed to organize effective resistance in less than 24 hours. "You're making this much more complicated than it needs to be," Agent Thompson said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Actually, I'm making it very simple. Answer my questions, and we can have a civilized conversation about resolving the situation. Continue lying to me, and you'll find out what happens when you threaten a community that knows how to fight back."
The standoff in Henderson's hardware stretched on for nearly a minute, with both fake agents clearly recalculating their options now that they understood the scope of the resistance they faced. Agent Morrison kept glancing toward the store's windows, where Sheriff Reynolds' patrol car was indeed parked, with its emergency lights flashing in a pattern that would signal backup to any law enforcement officer who saw it. Agent Thompson was watching Maggie herself, apparently trying to determine whether she was bluffing about the level of support she had organized. "You don't understand the situation you've inserted yourself into," Agent Morrison said finally. "Operation Silent Thunder involved intelligence materials that could compromise ongoing operations and endanger the lives of current operatives. We're trying to prevent those materials from falling into the wrong hands." "By murdering the people who might have access to them?" Maggie asked. "That's an interesting approach to protecting classified information." "The 3 operatives who disappeared weren't murdered," Agent Thompson replied. "They were relocated to secure facilities for debriefing, standard protocol for situations involving compromised intelligence." It was a lie, and they all knew it, but it was the kind of lie that revealed important information. If the fake agents were claiming that the missing operatives had been relocated rather than killed, it suggested that whoever was behind this operation needed the operatives alive, at least temporarily. That could only mean one thing. They were being interrogated for information about the location of the missing Silent Thunder materials. "Where are these secure facilities?" she asked. "Classified," Agent Morrison responded automatically. "Then prove to me that my former colleagues are alive and well. Show me evidence that they're being treated according to the protocols you claim to be following." The request clearly caught both men off guard. They exchanged a quick glance that told her they had no such evidence because it didn't exist. Whatever had happened to the missing 3 operatives, it hadn't involved relocation to secure debriefing facilities. Before either fake agent could respond, the store's phone rang. Maggie answered it while keeping her eyes fixed on her unwelcome visitors. "Henderson's Hardware, this is Margaret." "Maggie, it's Sarah," Dr. Wilmot's voice came through the receiver, clear enough that everyone in the store could hear her. "Colonel Martinez wants to speak with your visitors. He says he has some questions about their authorization for this operation." It was perfectly orchestrated. Dr. Wilmot was giving Maggie a way to escalate the situation while simultaneously putting pressure on the fake agents. If they were truly legitimate, they would have no reason to refuse to speak with a retired colonel who was acting on behalf of concerned civilians. If they were imposters, they would have to find a way to decline without raising further suspicions. "Agent Morrison, Agent Thompson," Maggie said, holding out the phone's receiver, "Colonel Martinez would like a word with you." Agent Morrison made no move to take the phone. "We don't have time for conversations with retired military personnel. This is a federal investigation, and we don't need to justify our actions to civilians." Actually, Sheriff Reynolds' voice came from the store's entrance as the lawman stepped inside with his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "When federal agents conduct operations in my jurisdiction, they absolutely need to justify their actions, especially when those operations involve threatening local residents." The arrival of the sheriff fundamentally changed the dynamics in the store. Now the fake agents were outnumbered, surrounded, and facing the choice between maintaining their cover story in the face of mounting evidence that they were imposters, or revealing their true nature and risking exposure of whatever larger operation they represented. "Sheriff, this is a matter of national security," Agent Thompson said, but his voice carried less conviction than it had earlier. "Then you won't mind providing proper documentation of your authority to conduct this investigation," Sheriff Reynolds replied. "Federal agents operating in local jurisdictions are required to notify local law enforcement and provide copies of their warrants and operational authorizations." It was a masterful move. Sheriff Reynolds was using standard law enforcement protocols to force the fake agents into a position where they would have to produce documentation they couldn't possibly possess, or admit that they were operating without proper authorization. "Our authorization is classified," Agent Morrison said, but he was clearly struggling to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his ability to manage. "Not the existence of the authorization," Sheriff Reynolds responded. "Federal law requires that local law enforcement be notified when classified operations are conducted in their jurisdiction. The details can be classified, but the authorization itself must be documented through proper channels." Maggie watched this exchange with growing admiration for the sheriff's tactical skills. He was systematically dismantling the fake agent's cover story using nothing more than standard bureaucratic procedures and his own knowledge of how legitimate federal operations were conducted. "Furthermore," Sheriff Reynolds continued, "I've been in contact with the FBI field office in Houston, and they have no record of any active investigation in Cedar Ridge. In fact, they were quite surprised to learn that agents claiming to represent the Bureau were conducting unauthorized interviews with local residents." The trap was now complete. The fake agents could no longer maintain their federal credentials, they were surrounded by hostile locals who knew their true nature, and their entire operation had been compromised. The question now was whether they would surrender peacefully or escalate to violence. Agent Morrison made the decision for both of them. His hand moved toward his concealed weapon with practice speed, but he had underestimated the woman he had been hunting. Margaret Chen might have spent 8 years organizing inventory and helping customers, but Commander Harrison's reflexes were still intact. The hammer she had positioned within reach became a projectile that caught Agent Morrison in the shoulder before he could clear his weapon from his holster. As he staggered backward, Sheriff Reynolds drew his service pistol, and Agent Thompson found himself facing the business end of .40 caliber Glock held by a man who'd been in law enforcement for 30 years. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Reynolds said calmly, "you're under arrest for impersonating federal agents, making terrorist threats, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping."
The arrest of the fake agents sent shockwaves through the surveillance teams that had been monitoring Cedar Ridge. Within minutes of Sheriff Reynolds handcuffing Agent Morrison and Agent Thompson, the carefully positioned watchers began evacuating their positions with the kind of coordinated efficiency that spoke to extensive planning and preparation. Frank Morrison's construction workers, who had been documenting the surveillance operation, watched as vehicles with out-of-state license plates departed the area in a pattern that suggested professional tactical withdrawal. But even as the immediate threat seemed to be diminishing, Maggie knew that the real danger was just beginning. Whoever was behind the systematic elimination of Silent Thunder operatives would not simply abandon their mission because 2 of their operatives had been captured. If anything, the exposure of their operation would likely accelerate their timeline and increase their willingness to use extreme measures. "We need to get these men to a secure facility for interrogation," she told Sheriff Reynolds as they waited for backup units to arrive, "but not the county jail. Whoever they're working for will have resources to either extract them or silence them permanently." Sheriff Reynolds nodded grimly. "I've already contacted the FBI field office in Houston. Real federal agents are en route to take custody, and they're bringing a full tactical team in case there are more operatives in the area." Agent Morrison, despite the injury to his shoulder, was maintaining his silence with the discipline of someone who'd been trained to resist interrogation. Agent Thompson was more vocal, alternating between demands to be released and threats about the consequences of interfering with a national security operation. But neither man was providing any useful information about their employers or their mission. Dr. Wilmot arrived at the hardware store just as the legitimate FBI agents were taking custody of the prisoners. She brought with her Colonel Martinez, who had driven down from Austin as soon as he'd learned about the situation. The retired colonel was everything that his military record suggested: calm, competent, and absolutely furious about the threat to a former operative who had served her country with distinction. "Commander Harrison," he said, using Maggie's operational title for the first time in 8 years, "we need to discuss your situation privately." They moved to the back office of the hardware store, where Colonel Martinez laid out a scenario that was even worse than Maggie had feared. According to his intelligence contacts, the systematic hunting of Silent Thunder operatives was being conducted by a private military contractor that had been hired by parties unknown. The contractor, called Blackwater Solutions, no relation to the more famous Blackwater Company, specialized in what they euphemistically called problem resolution for clients who needed absolute discretion. The 3 missing operatives were all taken alive initially. Our intelligence suggests they were interrogated for information about the location of classified materials from Operation Silent Thunder, and then eliminated once they'd provided everything they knew. "What materials are we talking about?" Maggie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Financial records, weapon supply chains, and identity lists." Silent Thunder wasn't just about stopping a terrorist network, it was about exposing the people who were funding and supplying them. Some very powerful individuals were implicated in those materials, and they've apparently decided that eliminating witnesses is preferable to facing justice. The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. Operation Silent Thunder had uncovered evidence that certain wealthy individuals and possibly even government officials had been involved in arms trafficking to terrorist organizations. The missing intelligence materials didn't just contain information about terrorist operations, they contained proof of high-level corruption and criminal activity by people with the resources to hire private military contractors to eliminate anyone who might expose them. "How long do we have before they send more operatives?" she asked. "According to our analysis of Blackwater Solutions' operational patterns, they'll probably wait 48 to 72 hours to assess the situation before deploying a new team. They'll want to understand how their operation was compromised and adjust their approach accordingly." It was a brief reprieve, but it also represented their best opportunity to take decisive action. Waiting for the next wave of operatives to arrive would put everyone in Cedar Ridge at continued risk, while going on the offensive might allow them to eliminate the threat at its source. "Colonel, I need to ask something of you that goes far beyond anything you should reasonably be expected to do for a former operative," Maggie said carefully. "I need help locating and neutralizing the people behind this operation before they can send more teams." Colonel Martinez studied her face with the appraising look of someone who had made life-and-death decisions about personnel throughout his military career. "What exactly are you proposing?"
I'm proposing that we stop reacting to their moves and start making some of our own. The fake agents will eventually provide information about their employers, either voluntarily or through enhanced interrogation techniques that the FBI can apply. Once we know who we're dealing with, we can take the fight to them instead of waiting for them to come after us. That would be vigilante justice, Commander. It would be operating outside legal channels and without official authorization. So was everything they've done to hunt down Silent Thunder operatives, she pointed out. Sometimes legal channels aren't sufficient to deal with threats that exist outside the law. Dr. Wilmot, who had been listening to their conversation from the doorway, spoke up unexpectedly. Colonel, when James was killed in Afghanistan, you told me that sometimes the best way to honor fallen soldiers was to make sure their sacrifice meant something. If Margaret doesn't stop these people, how many more former operatives will disappear? How many more communities like Cedar Ridge will be threatened? It was a compelling argument, and one that clearly resonated with the retired colonel's sense of duty and justice. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. What do you need from me? I need everything you can tell me about Blackwater Solutions, their operational methods, and most importantly, their client list. And if possible, I'd like to borrow some of your more specialized contacts in the intelligence community. As they began planning what would essentially be a counterintelligence operation run by civilians and retired military personnel, Maggie felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. For 8 years, she had been Margaret Chen, helpful and harmless. But now, with her community threatened and her friends in danger, it was time to remind the world why Commander Harrison had been one of the most effective operatives in Silent Thunder.
The transformation that took place over the next 24 hours was remarkable to witness. Cedar Ridge, which had been a sleepy Texas town focused on high school football and weekend barbecues, evolved into something resembling a covert operations base. Frank Morrison's construction company became a cover for surveillance and reconnaissance activities. Dr. Wilmot's medical practice provided a secure communications hub for coordinating with Colonel Martinez's military contacts. Sheriff Reynolds' department served as the command center for what was rapidly becoming a sophisticated counterintelligence operation. But the most dramatic transformation was in Maggie herself. As she shed the last vestiges of her Margaret Chen persona and fully embraced her identity as Commander Harrison, her friends began to understand just how extraordinary the woman they'd known as a hardware store clerk really was. She moved with a fluidity and purpose that spoke to years of advanced training. She analyzed intelligence reports with the kind of systematic precision that only came from extensive experience in covert operations. Most impressively, she coordinated the various elements of their improvised team with the natural authority of someone who had commanded complex missions under life-threatening circumstances. The interrogation of the fake agents had finally yielded results. Agent Thompson, faced with federal charges that would likely result in life imprisonment, had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. The information he provided painted a picture of a conspiracy that reached far higher into the government and business establishment than anyone had imagined. Blackwater Solutions was indeed a private military contractor, but it was essentially a front organization for a group of wealthy individuals who had been exposed by Operation Silent Thunder's intelligence gathering. These individuals, including 2 senators, a defense contractor, several foreign nationals, and at least one high-ranking CIA official, had been funneling weapons and funding to terrorist organizations while publicly supporting counterterrorism efforts. When Silent Thunder had uncovered evidence of their involvement, they had used their influence to ensure that the operation's conclusion was handled quietly, with most of the damaging intelligence materials supposedly destroyed. But Commander Harrison had kept copies of everything. During the chaotic extraction from the compromised safe house 8 years earlier, she had managed to download the complete Silent Thunder intelligence database to encrypted drives that she had hidden rather than turning them over to her handlers. At the time, it had been a survival instinct. She had suspected that someone within the intelligence community had betrayed her team, and she wanted insurance in case she needed to prove her innocence or expose the traitor. Now, those drives represented the evidence needed to bring down a conspiracy that had already resulted in the deaths of at least 6 people, including the 3 missing Silent Thunder operatives and the 2 real FBI agents whose identities had been stolen. The drives are hidden in a secure location that would take me approximately 6 hours to reach, she explained to the assembled team in Sheriff Reynolds' office. Once I retrieve them, we'll have enough evidence to expose everyone involved in this conspiracy and ensure that no more former operatives are targeted. Colonel Martinez looked up from the intelligence reports he'd been reviewing. Commander, retrieving those drives will expose your location to anyone who might be monitoring for that kind of activity. Encrypted intelligence materials generate distinctive electronic signatures when they're accessed or transmitted. I know, which is why we're going to make sure that when they come for me, they walk into a trap instead of finding a hardware store clerk they can intimidate. The plan they developed over the next several hours was audacious, dangerous, and precisely the kind of operation that should never have been attempted by civilians and retired personnel operating without official authorization. But it was also their best chance to end the threat permanently, rather than simply postponing it until the next wave of operatives arrived. Frank Morrison would coordinate the civilian aspects of the operation, using his construction crews and local contacts to provide security and logistical support. Dr. Wilmot would maintain communication with legitimate law enforcement and intelligence agencies, ensuring that when the evidence was finally delivered, it would be delivered to people who could act on it. Sheriff Reynolds would handle the law enforcement elements, working with federal agents to ensure that any criminals captured during the operation would face proper justice. And Commander Harrison would do what she did best: disappear into the shadows and strike at enemies who thought they were the hunters rather than the hunted. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge on what would be her last evening as a resident of the town, Maggie stood in the empty hardware store and said goodbye to the life she had built. She ran her fingers along the familiar shelves, inhaled the scent of oil and metal that had become so comforting over the years, and tried to memorize every detail of the place that had given her 8 years of peace. Tomorrow, she would retrieve the encrypted drives that contained enough evidence to destroy a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and business. She would face professional killers who had eliminated some of the most skilled operatives in U.S. intelligence history. She would risk not only her own life, but the lives of the people who had become her chosen family. But tonight, for a few more hours, she could still be Margaret Chen, hardware store clerk, beloved member of a small Texas community that gave her the greatest gift anyone could receive: the knowledge that she was home. As she locked the store for what might be the final time, she whispered a promise to the empty street: "I'll come back. Whatever happens, I'll find a way to come home." The next morning, Commander Harrison began the mission that would either end the threat to Silent Thunder operatives forever or ensure that Margaret Chen joined the list of people who had simply vanished without a trace.
The abandoned warehouse outside Dallas looked exactly like the kind of place where bad things happened to good people. Sitting in an industrial district that had been slowly decaying for the better part of a decade, it was surrounded by empty lots, rusted chain-link fencing, and the kind of desolate urban landscape that most people avoided after dark. But for Commander Harrison, it was perfect, isolated enough that civilian casualties would be impossible, large enough to accommodate the tactical situation she was planning to create, and most importantly, it contained the hidden vault where she had stored the Silent Thunder intelligence materials 8 years earlier. The encrypted drives were exactly where she had left them, sealed in a climate-controlled container that had protected them from both environmental damage and electronic detection. As she connected the first drive to her laptop and began the decryption process, she felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. These files contained enough evidence to destroy the careers and freedom of some very powerful people, but accessing them would also send an unmistakable signal to anyone monitoring for Silent Thunder materials that Commander Harrison was still alive and active. She had been in the warehouse for exactly 17 minutes when the first surveillance drone appeared outside the windows. 34 minutes after her arrival, vehicles began taking positions around the building's perimeter.
By the time she had finished downloading and transmitting the intelligence files to Colonel Martinez, Sheriff Reynolds, and 3 separate FBI field offices, the warehouse was surrounded by what appeared to be a full tactical team. But Commander Harrison had spent 8 years planning for exactly this scenario. Every detail of the warehouse had been memorized, every possible approach had been anticipated, and every contingency had been prepared for. What the tactical team surrounding the building didn't know was that they weren't hunting a desperate former operative trying to escape with stolen intelligence materials. They were walking into a carefully prepared trap that had been designed by one of the most effective covert operatives in U.S. military history. The first indication that something was wrong came when their communications equipment began experiencing systematic interference. The electronic jamming was precise and professional, targeting their radio frequencies while leaving their target's equipment untouched. The second indication came when their vehicle started experiencing mechanical problems, flat tires, disabled engines, and electrical systems that mysteriously failed at critical moments. By the time they realized that the warehouse wasn't just a hiding place, but an elaborate kill zone, it was too late to withdraw without suffering significant casualties. Commander Harrison didn't kill anyone that night. She didn't have to. Instead, she systematically dismantled their tactical capabilities, captured their communications equipment, and documented their identities and affiliations. When law enforcement arrived, summoned by anonymous tips that had been timed to coincide with the conclusion of her defensive operations, they found 11 Blackwater Solutions operatives zip-tied and waiting for arrest, along with enough evidence to connect them to the murders of federal agents and the disappearances of former Silent Thunder personnel. The intelligence materials that Commander Harrison transmitted that night sparked the largest investigation of government corruption and private military contractor abuse in U.S. history. 2 senators were arrested on charges of treason and conspiracy to commit terrorism. A defense contractor worth billions of dollars was dissolved after its executives were charged with arms trafficking. The CIA official who had been receiving payments from foreign terrorist organizations was found dead in his home, apparently by suicide, though investigators suspected he had been eliminated by his former co-conspirators to prevent further revelations. But the most significant result of that night's operation was the complete dismantling of the conspiracy that had been systematically eliminating Silent Thunder operatives. With their financial resources frozen, their political protection removed, and their operational personnel in federal custody, the organization responsible for at least 6 deaths simply ceased to exist. 3 weeks later, Margaret Chen returned to Cedar Ridge. She had been officially debriefed by legitimate federal agents, cleared of any wrongdoing related to her retention of classified materials, and offered a position with a classified government task force that would have provided her with the kind of excitement and purpose that had defined her earlier career. But she had declined the offer in favor of something that meant more to her than any mission ever could: coming home. The hardware store looked exactly the same as it had when she'd left it. Frank Morrison and his crew had maintained the inventory, Dr. Wilmot had handled the books, and Sheriff Reynolds had made sure that everything was ready for her return. Even the coffee maker was programmed to start brewing at 6 a.m., just the way she liked it. On her first morning back, Tommy Rodriguez was waiting outside the store before she arrived to open it. He was holding a newspaper, this one right side up and current, and grinning with the kind of enthusiasm that made her remember why she had fallen in love with this community in the first place. "Miss Chen," he called out as she approached the store, "did you hear? We beat Central High 28-14. Coach said it was the best game we've played all season. I wished you could have been there to see it." "I wished I could have been there too, Tommy," she replied, unlocking the door and flipping the sign from closed to open for what felt like the first time in her life. "But there's always next week's game." As she went through the familiar routine of starting her day, Margaret Chen realized that she had finally found something that no covert operation, no matter how successful, could provide: the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, Henderson's hardware was thriving, Tommy Rodriguez had received a full scholarship to study engineering, and the people of Cedar Ridge had returned to worrying about things like sprinkler systems, weekend barbecues, and whether their high school football team could make it to the state championship. And Margaret Chen, hardware clerk, lived peacefully ever after. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up.
just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.